Welcome to this week's episode of Promising Young Surgeon. I want to talk today about how so many of us as doctors, nurses, really all healthcare workers approach their work. There's this idea that everyone needs to be excellent and that falling short of this standard is unacceptable. Just about every hospital or program mission statement will mention some version of, quote, excellence in care and, quote, maintaining a standard of excellence. But how, as individuals, do we actually get there? Is the answer to study 24/7, practice hours and hours every day, never taking a day off, beating ourselves up until we're perfect? What if there was another approach, and perhaps an even more effective one that could actually yield true excellence, but may in fact lead us to be more well-rounded people and to achieve our goals more efficiently? So, I'm about to say a dirty word, something that has basically been scrubbed from the dictionary of acceptable language for physicians. Mediocrity. How can we accept the idea of mediocrity when there are lives at stake in what we do? Well, maybe we're just looking at it the wrong way, and that's what we're here to discuss today. So, mediocrity is an idea, it's a way of life that I have read about, and Colin joins us today to do a deep dive. Colin, how would you define mediocrity?
So I think you want to look at mediocrity in relation to excellence. So like you said, excellence is something that's sort of thrown around and is very common, specifically in healthcare. But I mean, in a lot of, careers and, in this kind of modern age, there's a way for mediocrity, right? Like you said, it's kind of like a dirty word. So basically, if you think of excellence as, let's say, optimization towards a finite goal. So there's one specific thing you're trying to do, and you are optimizing to get to the 99th percentile, the 100% best you can do in that specific thing. This is going to use up basically all of your possible resources for that specific current goal. Mediocrity is kind of the opposite of that in the sense that it allows for excess, at least a slight amount of excess, which can give you the ability to explore new things. It opens up the door to creativity, and it also sort of passively plans for the future. Right. So if excellence and optimization is for this like in current time finite goal, then mediocrity keeps the door open. It allows you to kind of have one foot in, one foot out, kind of gives you that flexibility.
So, I feel like I have to say, and I have to start out and be like, I'm not the bad guy here. I am a practicing head and neck ENT surgeon. Colin is going to try to convince us about this whole mediocrity thing. Okay. I'm definitely here to raise the questions that I am naturally going to have about that as a surgeon. This is like such a really exacting, detail-oriented, granular, critically important work that we do. But it's interesting because even as you kind of are defining it there and talking about that, well, then I start to think, what is the functional or meaningful difference between being like a 95th percentile ENT physician or a 99th percentile ENT physician? And I start to wonder, and I'm thinking to myself, like, even while you're talking about this, I'm thinking, okay, for instance, somebody who's out in practice, they could spend 100% of their free time reading every week's JAMA, attending every national or regional conference on the topics, making sure that they are just up to the hilt, like ingesting all of the new and up-to-date information and reviewing all the old information and just like absolutely eating it up. But it's like, if we could trade some of that time and those finite resources to like learn new skills that augment our practices, okay, that's an attractive thought. I would have interest in that.
Yeah, and I would even push back more because you said, the 95th percentile, right? I think it's, like Dunning-Kruger effect, right? That everyone basically overestimates their own skill. I'm probably getting a little bit wrong, but that's kind of the principle of it. The idea of excellence, like as it's used today, is probably just kind of wrong, right? In the sense that if you're literally talking about within the cohort of ENTs, you're striving to be the 95th percentile. I mean, yeah, that's really high, right? Like there's only so many ENTs. That means you're a literally top, 100 ENT, whatever it is, like in the entire country. That itself is probably too far, right? You've spent so much time optimizing for this one skill that you're even probably well past the point of diminishing returns. Whereas really, like when you think about excellence, it's actually pretty, like to the outside of observer, it looks like excellence, but if you're in that level, it's probably actually average, right? So,
and I get what you're saying, because like realistically, you're totally right. I wasn't really thinking about that where it's like stratified just by, okay, like this specific specialty, all those physicians. Because yes, what you're saying is that there have to be, by definition, a ton of physicians who are like 50th percentile physicians. Obviously, that rustles the feathers. Like I can't imagine any physician who'd like proudly walk into a room and be like, "What's up, guys? I'm strong 50th percentile, like of all oncologists. I'm here to say hello." That's terrifying. People would be like, "Oh my God, I want a different doctor," But I agree with you that like, even realistically, if you did get that 50th percentile physician, I could imagine where externally, where they're viewed by their staff, their patients, things like that, like people would be like, "That's an excellent doctor. I love that man or woman."
Yeah, because even if you literally are the just dead middle 50th percentile ENT in the country, in the specific area that you're practicing or the hospital that you're in, it's not going to be a lie to say, excellence in ENT, if that's like your marketing slogan, to the general public. And even to like some of the other doctors, in the hospital, that's going to hold true because they're looking at this level that they're not really aware of and thinking, oh, this is excellent behavior, or this is excellent surgical skills, or whatever it is. But within the groups of ENTs, it's actually kind of middling behavior, right? You're down the middle. That's kind of how you have to think about like spending your time striving towards excellent in one specific thing, because it's just, you can only go so far, and there's pretty rapidly going to be a point of diminishing returns where you're just banging your head against the wall trying to get to this 95th percentile and like letting all these other opportunities kind of go by the wayside.
Right. And I definitely like I said, that's an attractive thought. Like, of course, I don't want to spend undue time beyond the point of diminishing returns. I would imagine like a lot of doctors feel spread thin, pulled in different directions. So, of course, like you have my attention there. But when you do talk about how people can lower their standards to achieve growth and things like that, it sounds paradoxical. Honestly, it is like straight up a little offensive. Like it's so hard because it's ingrained in us as physicians to not accept any lower standards. And, like I said, like the work that we do can be life and death, and it's certainly health, and it's so critically important. So just even, it's funny because a lot of this language even has like emotion tied to it. And so I'm willing to hear your logical, whatever you have to say about this, but I already bristle.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. And I think most would, but it really is like a matter of kind of reframing how you're thinking about the idea of excellence, right? Because surgery is probably the best scenario to think about this, and in that you literally cannot drop below a certain standard, right? Because if you show up in a life or death situation and you drop your standards so low that, let's say you were just messing with a spreadsheet, whatever. So that spreadsheet doesn't work quite as well. But in this case, like someone might literally die. So there is, a specific level that you have to stay above. And probably some room above that where you would want to grow beyond just the bare minimum, obviously, to, have consistently good outcomes, as well as, to gain the reputation that, you're a trusted surgeon and, people.
Right. So there's a threshold you have to exceed. And then there's a range that maybe is an ideal range. And then there's going to be another point where you keep going past that. And that's the point of diminishing returns.
Yeah, so if you think about it in like the like a training setting, right? In residency, I mean, you have to learn a lot of different things. You got to learn a bunch of different procedures, even just medical management, right? There's going to be tons of different things that are coming up against, your finite amount of resources. I mean, it takes a bit of finesse and kind of creativity to understand like what that level is. But if you think about everything as kind of like, steps or a ladder, when you are close enough to that top step, rather than trying to, kind of take that graduated, upward curve, like to the next step, you just say, you know what, I'm good enough on this step. I'm going to jump to the next one. I'm going to move on. I haven't maybe mastered that technique, but I'm pretty good. I think I will, with some repetition, get better at it over time. I'm going to move on to the next thing. So
how practically does that work with lowering standards?
The idea is to kind of, half-ass it in a way, right? While you're able to figure it out. And part of this too is giving you the ability to fail, right? So if you are spending so much time optimizing towards this one specific skill or whatever it is, it might be that you're just actually not that good at it. And you've now wasted tons and tons of time, tons of resources. And you just keep thinking, I just got to keep pushing through. I got to keep pushing through. But if you're adopting this other mindset, there comes a point in time where you say, hey, you know what? Maybe this just isn't for me. I want to pivot and do something else, right? It doesn't mean you can't be an ENT. You might just say, I don't like ear surgery that much, right? I've done a decent amount of this and it's just, I'm okay at it. But it's just not my specialty. It's not something I'm really loving. So let's move on and try something else. You have to be able to pass that piece of it, but is that going to be your forever thing? Probably not.
Well, I actually feel like when you do talk about that point, like let's say that somebody is in the range of competence. I guess we could call it like the range of competence because and depending on how you define excellence, you're in there, but you're in that like middle percentile. But one way in which like I can even see some elements of this coming into play are that, I'm a couple years out in my practice, and that first year after residency, that is a pretty high stress time. Like, of course, the learning curve is very, very steep on that. And even though, yes, you've been training for many, many years, it's like doing everything on your own for the first time. And in my experience, I started a solo practice from nothing. Like I received an empty office space and kind of like, a list of items that can be ordered from McKesson to stock an ENT clinic. And, I picked out chairs for the ENT clinic and things like that. So that first year, it really, from my experience, it just took so much to make absolutely sure that everything is worked up appropriately, correctly, safely, to make sure that nothing's missed, to make sure that like system processes are in place, and that one is really like, on their own, practicing all this medicine in clinic and also operating in the OR. And so that was like very all encompassing. That was an extremely demanding time. And a lot of people talk about the first 5 years out in practice as being that way. They kind of say, okay, after 5 years out alone, you really you should have it quite down pat. Like you should be feeling good then for the next 15, 20, whatever it may be. But what's interesting is that I can even see a huge difference within these first 5 years, like the early career, timeline. Because after that first year, okay, I started to be able to have a lot of spiels, for lack of a better word, like down pat. And, I'd use the example of course, we get tons of referrals for older patients who have presbycusis, which is natural hearing loss that comes with age. Like imagine a bilateral, both-sided sensory neural hearing loss. That's the type that we all get with wear and tear, noise exposure, again, hearing loss of aging. And that often comes with some variant of, let's say they also have tinnitus or ringing in the ears on both sides. And so if they come in and see me as a new patient and there's no asymmetry to the hearing loss and there's no red flags at all on their audio and temps, like this can be a very straightforward type of thing. And, that spiel, imagine things like sub-centimeter thyroid nodules. Like there's just so much in the ENT world where, yeah, the clinical management is quite straightforward. It's all really very algorithmic. Sure, maybe once a week, something quite shocking or very new in terms of pathology will walk in. And there's so much variety in ENT. And so absolutely, like we do see that and I appreciate that. But there's so much that is down pat that's still like, yes, I already have done this now over 100 times. And, with that comes familiarity with all that. And then I guess that instead of going from a couple extra percentage points on how good of a spiel you do on presbycusis, I have been able to spend a little bit more time just reading books of interest to me. And one example I would use is The Charisma Myth, which I recently read. And I really enjoyed it because the myth is that people are either born with charisma or not. And, this woman just kind of takes the time to systematically debunk that and then also train the reader in ways to practice, utilize more charisma, ways to win more charisma points in any interaction. And another book that comes to mind too, actually, that I really loved within the past couple months was The French Art of Not Trying Too Hard. And that is, of course, like a self-help and lifestyle book, but it was so wonderful. And I guess that it was wonderful and it really offers a different angle at looking at life, which you can kind of imagine is also like the antithesis of being a doctor or becoming a doctor. I would say the anti-tome is The French Art of Not Trying Too Hard. But what I would basically say is that I can see benefit to physicians broadening their horizons in ways like this. I mean, neither of those books really have anything directly to do with clinical medicine, yet they could take a doctor really to the next level, I think, even in practice of medicine and surgery.
Yeah. You probably didn't even do this on purpose, but your example of practicing a spiel for like little old ladies who can barely hear you. Yeah, that would not be a great use of time because they can barely hear what you're saying. So that is definitely like get your, function over form, just get it out as good as you can and, move on to the next thing. But yeah, I mean, I do think, especially when you're like thinking about making a transition from like medical school or residency into practice, like you don't have to really compete with people once you're in practice. I mean, sure, there's maybe some, small departmental competition or whatever, maybe some fighting over patients or whatever, but it really doesn't have anything to do with like your skill necessarily. So you spend all this time in training in medical school, like showing your elevated level of knowledge and how good you are at everything. But then you get into practice and you have to convince patients who have no idea what you're talking about that you are confident, you have the answers and you're going to help them. And those are just very different skills than, studying and practicing your surgical technique. Like we said, I mean, obviously you have to get to a certain threshold to be able to, function within those, but there's just many, many other aspects that are going to become way more important as you kind of get out like into your own practice.
And if everybody did adopt this mindset, lowering their standards and striving for mediocrity, obviously the feared outcome would be that there's mediocre everything. And so, of course, like I wouldn't want to receive mediocre healthcare. I would not want to eat at a restaurant that has mediocre service.
Yeah, it's important to realize that if you are thinking this about something, right? Because this is kind of all relative. So if you're showing up to a restaurant or a doctor's office and you're saying, this was just really mediocre, everything I got. Honestly, maybe it is. Maybe it's just bad food and, they're just being sloppy. If that's true, they're probably then going to go out of business, relatively soon. If just nobody likes it, they're just doing a bad job. But in reality, what might be happening is that system, organization, whatever it is actually kind of optimizing for something else, right? So in a restaurant, that server, you might say, hey, that was mediocre service. Like, I really didn't like it. They're probably not worried about spending a lot of time and getting, the absolute best experience for you because maybe their game is high volume. I want to have as many tables as possible. And I know that no matter how good I do, they're probably not going to leave more than like a 25%, 30% tip. So I would rather take a 15% tip from every table and double my amount of tables I can cover versus, really focusing on 6 to 8 tables per night. So in that sense, like understanding, where that vested interest is like within the organization, kind of allows you to see what the end game is and understand like the level that those people are playing at. So it might not actually be a mediocre thing that, you're witnessing here. It might actually be quite optimized for a different goal.
Okay. So what practically happens if people start to be like, quote unquote, mediocre at work? Like, obviously one would worry about getting in trouble, getting caught, getting found out.
Again, like obviously there is a certain threshold, right? And a lot of that's going to be very situational. So you're going to have to see what's acceptable within, either your training program to your peers, right? You have to be somewhat like on the level to kind of keep it going. But basically, if you're sticking to like these rigid, really high standards, whatever it is, it's going to keep you really locked into the present, right? So potentially more dangerous than flirting with the edge of mediocrity, getting in trouble a little bit, is that you are honestly very likely to get stuck in a certain paradigm, right? You're very likely to get stuck in the present there, to where it's going to make it hard. You might get through that specific, trial, test, whatever it is, but as you continue in your career, you're probably really going to be stuck at that point where you spent all of your resources and all of your learning on one thing, right? Medicine is very much a changing environment, especially, it's going faster and faster now, right? There's new drugs, new techniques, new whatever it is, new studies, findings, everything that's sort of advancing, your specific specialty practice. And the striving towards excellence in a certain thing is going to probably keep you stuck in the past.
Or like on a hamster wheel, I guess.
Yeah,
almost
sure.
what that feels like too. And
Right.
I just think that this reminds me of like a lot of arguments that I make about, teaching DBT, dialectic behavioral therapy type informed skills to like medical students. Like, yes, it's not anatomy. It's not like a dissection lab. It's not a textbook learning type of thing. But those are skills where if you were planning for the future, like I can tell every student that they are going to need skills over the next several years and really their long career, hopefully, where they have excellent interpersonal effectiveness skills. Like they're able to get from other people what they need from them, number one, while maintaining a positive relationship with them, number two. But that's such an example of kind of like a soft skill that's very much outside of the textbook clinical skills and, clinical practice workbook.
Yeah. And that's just so often not prioritized by like a training department, right? If you think about, what would be considered sort of a malignant program, likely what is happening is that who's ever kind of setting the standard for that is stuck in this excellence mindset, right? Where they have extremely high rigid standards, but to a very specific thing. And that might not be, especially if it's like 2 generations removed from, the people that are practicing, that might not be what this whole cohort of residents or med students like is trying to get to. So you really get this, conflict that there might not really be a way out, right? You get stuck in this sort of authoritarian, environment to where the only option that you're given is to expend all of your resources, towards this goal that frankly might not help you as an individual.
That's true. And there's a lot of residency and medical training, being a medical student, resident, fellow, all of it, where, some of those tasks I actually do think may fit nicely under that thought. So for instance, patient transport, phlebotomy. I used to occasionally get sent down to the mail room to search for an instrument that was supposed to have arrived 2 days ago. And now the patient's already in pre-op and, we're about to roll back for surgery and no one can find this object. So there are some kind of even like clerical tasks where, I guess, transport of a patient should just kind of be transport of a patient. I would actually accept being the 50th percentile level at that task.
Yeah. Interestingly, like, yes, a lot of, patient transport, right? That's probably never going to help you. But in some ways, like having part of your training be some of these extra administrative type stuff, it's actually probably going to be helpful for you, right? Because let's say like the rule of your training was we spend all of our waking hours in clinic or in the operating room. That's it. We have staff, they do everything else. You guys don't do anything. You don't write your notes. Like you just, scribe them, like all that stuff. And then you get out into private practice. And now, like you, for instance, you start a brand new practice. You had to figure out how to get instruments. Like you do a ton of stuff on your own. If you had just never had any experience with that, you're a pretty resourceful person, but obviously the track to becoming a doctor is just like college, medical school, residency, and now you're a practicing doctor. Like there's going to be a lot of people that just don't have experience.
Yeah, not much work experience.
Yeah, or just like having to be creative and, because really if the mandate was we are here to do this one specific thing over and over every day, it's going to limit like your ability to grow and adapt in kind of a changing environment.
Yeah, and that's definitely true because, in addition to furnishing the practice and picking out, supplies for 6 months worth of work, which was obviously like a mathematical and hypothetical challenge, I had to build the schedule, and that's something that a lot of graduating physicians and surgeons are going to experience, especially if they are building something themselves. Then it literally, you get a blank page and you say, how many patients, are you able to see a day with what time blocks per patient? And anyone who has ever managed a healthcare clinic schedule knows the absolute jigsaw puzzle. Certainly in ENT too, I do a lot of scopes. So with scope visit, or which is, for those of you who haven't been to an ENT clinic, we do like laryngoscopy as well as nasal endoscopy. Those are different procedures to kind of basically really quickly in clinic look at the larynx. You could look at the vocal cords. Certainly anyone who says they have quote unquote hoarseness or dysphonia, chronic throat clearing, things like that. Nasal endoscopy is great because we do things like look for nasal polyps. We look at purulence coming out of the nose. And, I can take cultures in clinic, but the point just being that like when I had to train my totally new to ENT staff, like we started at the beginning just to kind of talk about, okay, well, what are these procedures? Because they have tons of clinical experience, just not an ENT clinic. We do a lot of ear cleanings, ear foreign bodies. Like what are the time slots for all of these news versus returns versus a post-op? And so I definitely do agree with you. And I think that getting adept at problem solving and, scheduling administrative tasks, things like that. Sure. Like it has value, but I really, I can see diminishing returns at that. Like what's the difference between somebody being 90th percentile incredible at jigsaw puzzles versus you're like 98th percentile jigsaw puzzler? Like, I don't know. Who cares? Life's too short.
Yeah, and that's very much like you just want to be able to do it, right? There's no like excellence involved in that. And obviously, it can swing the other way too, where there's probably residency programs or any other job, right, where you actually get saddled with a ton of this administrative stuff. And it's swinging so hard the other way. Or again, like we were talking about, where it's like you're marching towards this one specific thing because who's ever in charge has, set those rules, and there's really, you don't see a way out. That's kind of where this idea of like quiet quitting comes into play, right? It's being framed, in the mainstream as, oh, these Gen Zers, like they don't want to work, they don't want to show up. But really, they're showing up and they're saying, why am I in this office driving an hour to and from an office building to sit in a cubicle when I am just like given a laptop here? I could just bring that home, work at home, get the same stuff done, be less distracted. I'd probably do a better job, but I'm in this outdated model. My pay is not rising, similar to residency, you're kind of stuck in this thing. And so what happens is people just sort of start to pull back, and you say, you know what? I'm not going to optimize all of my time. I'm not going to spend so much time getting good at the skill that I'm not being rewarded for. I'm just being rewarded in the moment here, but I don't see career growth within this. I don't see pay raises, whatever it is. So I'm going to do basically the bare minimum. I'm going to find that threshold that doesn't, force me to get fired. And I'm going to spend my time doing other things. I'm going to learn different skills. I'm going to better myself in other ways that I see as useful, to me in my career moving forward.
And I think that I can just definitely relate to how difficult it is as a resident physician. This was a challenge at the time to see like in front of, beyond your hand, in front of your face. Like it definitely was living in the moment, making it day to day and things like that. And also, of course, like we are discussing multiple ends of this spectrum, because take it or leave it, this whole mediocrity discussion. But I think that many people can agree that what is a huge problem is when resident physicians just hold themselves to this like extremely, maybe unrealistic, maybe unattainable high standard across the board. They are trying to excel in every single way, every single day, right? Like that's kind of not any way to live. And like I said, I don't know that that's truly attainable. And one way where I think of this coming into play, especially as you talk about like somebody else's optimality or the whole SEO thought, like who are these systems built for, and like who's benefiting and what are you doing this task for and things like that. I mean, when I was a senior resident and, making sure that cases that came in overnight or like trauma add-ons and things like that got booked, I was just truly, getting it on the schedule, getting an attending to cover it, making sure that it ran on time, making sure that it ended in time. Occasionally attendings would say like, yeah, I'll cover that trauma. Like you can book it under me to roll to the OR, but I have to be out by this time. So like, I'll take this case, but I still have somewhere to be at 4:30. And so, that's crazy. But in those cases, like as the resident responsible for that patient, for the case, for the attending as well, because they've kind of given me like these limitations, I would just care so much and put so much weight onto making all those things work. So now imagine the OR's running late, or like a higher acuity trauma comes in and pushes us or something like that. It's really hard to not put that like 100% seriousness on everything, but it's just not a sustainable or healthy way to live. And so obviously, we're just talking because I guess my question would be like, what is the balance? There obviously has to be a middle path. And I'm definitely like a believer that the middle path is a good idea.
Yeah. Well, and I think too, like, I probably should have said this earlier, but again, the idea is not to actually be middling at everything, right? Like you're not trying to walk away from this and just be super mediocre. In reality, using this principle should actually result in higher performance, right? So like by banging your head against the wall and going after the same thing over and over again, yes, you will burn out, right? But the way, like, okay, so a good example would be, training for a race, a marathon, or just like a 5K even, right? So if you're trying to run your best time, you've got this race coming up in a month. If you just run a literal 5K every single day and you try to go as fast as you can, you probably get to a pretty good time. And then when you get to that race, you're running your absolute maximum effort at 100%, you're getting to the finish line and someone's about to pass you. You have nothing left in the tank, right? Like you've only practiced a 5K. You have optimized to be in the 99th percentile of that 5K. Someone's passing you, you're toast, right? So like the way to actually train for a race would be to mix it up, run different lengths, right? In that finish line, you're going to have to sprint a little bit. So practice sprints, run 400 meters, right? Practice running a 10K, practice running 15 miles and, max out your speed at that, work on your longevity. That way, when you're in the race, you only have to use about 90% of your energy, right? You can actually run faster at a longer speed. You can run much longer than a 5K. So you're not just absolutely toast by the end of that race. And if someone is passing you at that finish line, now you have an extra 10%, right? You've got that like next level to jump up and beat that person in a race. And that's kind of how you want to approach a lot of this stuff, right? Where you need to try and recognize like where that level ends for a specific behavior skill, and then see what the next one is and start striving for that, basically.
Yeah. And I think that the other thing that also makes this whole idea more palatable to me, like, having kind of discussed this back and forth, it's just that mediocre does not mean what you think it probably means, or what I thought it meant coming into this, because it does not mean that just like the care you provide is mediocre, and like patients think that, and and not just patients think that, but patients experience mediocre care. It's just more that I get what you're saying. ENT is a small field, and not everybody in ENT nationally can be a 90th percentile at ENT. And so I think that it really just becomes, physicians put so much like pressure on ourselves to be excellent. Like, I don't think anyone would just be hype to be under 90th percentile. Some physicians I know wouldn't accept themselves at under 99th percentile. But the reality is that the sample size just gets smaller and smaller, and there still has to be a distribution among them. And not only that, but I really like that running analogy, just because diversifying the skill set, I could be convinced that ultimately leads to a better, more excellent product or person.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think the other natural question, like we've danced around it a little bit, but is like, how do you get away with this, right? Like, this seems sort of a risky behavior, and like eventually the charade will be, pulled away, right? Someone's just going to say, hey, are you kind of sandbagging me this whole time? Like, what's going on? I feel like you're not giving me your full effort. Realistically, that's probably not going to happen very often, right? And if you think about it, like, this is a pretty common thing that is happening all over the place, right? Like a very simple example is, like a mom and child. You're playing a game that mom could just wipe the floor, with that kid, but they're going to kind of, they'll pretend like they're trying hard, and then maybe they stumble, and the little kid runs the race. The little kid is not going to stop and say, hey, mom, what's up? Like, I thought we were running this whole thing. Like, there's sort of a give and take, there's a balance. And then, maybe in reverse, right? Like, the mom is telling the kid, hey, you got to clean your room every single day. The kid doesn't clean his room. Everybody, keeps it clean enough. That's really what we're trying to get, right? We just want a reasonably clean room. There is sort of this back and forth tug of, okay, I'm going to not give my full effort, but I'm also going to mask potentially like what my full ability is, right? Because if you actually do show in surgery, right? Let's say you are capable of doing in 16-hour surgery every single day. You're like a superhuman and you're able to do that. They're going to ask you to do that 16-hour surgery every single day. So like, there has to be this kind of give and take. And realistically, no one probably would do that. But in like a worst case scenario, they might ask you to keep coming back. Or let's say like you gain the reputation of always being at the hospital, right? You now know this resident. They're always around. They're always available to jump in. People are going to keep asking you to jump in, right? They're going to ask you to fill in. They're going to say, hey, do you want to get in on this? It's eventually just going to lead to you burning out. You're never going to be home. You're never going to have any time. You have to be able to kind of mask your ability in some respects, based upon really like the other party's level of power, right? Because let's say you are working with the chair of the department and they're asking you to do something specific. Well, that person might literally control your future, right? That might be the person who decides whether you're getting fired. They're going to give you the letter of recommendation. In that case, you might want to give almost your full effort for that, right? Still probably not 100%. Maybe you give 90% so that if, the timing is right, you can once in a while drop in that 100% and they say, wow, oh my God, the stuff I've been teaching them has been working. They are amazing. Like, I'm the best teacher. This is now my, my star pupil. But if this is someone who to not have a lot of power within the department and they're constantly asking you for favors, you can probably give 50% of your ability for that. And they are not really going to have the ability to get you in trouble for that, right? And they probably know that, right? They can't threaten to fire you because they might not have the ability to fire you. And if they do, and they're not able to follow through with that threat, now the whole charade's broken, right? And now you can just totally sandbag because they've shown that they have no power and you're good to go. So there is this like give and take that happens naturally. And it allows you to work at this, mediocre level without having to look mediocre all the time.
Well, I appreciate the discussion. I'm intrigued about like the whole idea of capability masking. Obviously, as a surgeon, I cannot possibly like condone this or endorse it. But
okay.
I do think it's interesting.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh. Okay. Try to convince me again.
Here's a simple example, right? All doctors ask everyone, you got to be here 15, 30 minutes before your appointment. Everyone who goes to the doctors knows that it's not going to start on time. So you're both keeping up the charade of you got to be here early and then you're going to start on time. And none of it happens and it's just accepted, right? It's like, well, obviously they're not doing as much as they can. So maybe I'll show up a little bit late. They're probably not going to kick me out. I've got about a 15-minute window. There's this understanding that like you don't have to be absolutely optimal at everything. Maybe that helps.
But should we try to be? Well, anyway, yeah, obviously, everyone is going to have their own kind of experiences with this and opinions, but I do think that like there's so much business strategy, workplace strategy, playing the game, how to approach all these things that, has been mastered by a lot of people, like even across the business world. And it's definitely about time that physicians start to really look at it and utilize the principles that work for them. Like that's the whole point of these strategy episodes. It's just to say, how do people excel at what they're doing? Because there's so much that is very much applicable to healthcare providers, really like at every level. So,
yeah. Well, hopefully I'm a properly mediocre guest to discuss this thing with you.
Oh my gosh. Well, we'll definitely, we enjoy doing the strategy episodes. We're always open to any feedback or questions. If listeners have specific topics that they want, like dissected, strategized, then we're always open to those. And so definitely let us know. We'll keep coming back. Next week, we have Dr. Chelsea Churgan on the podcast to discuss her decision to leave her OB-GYN residency and how she created the life of her dreams. Follow me on Instagram at francismay.md and at Rethinking Residency. Visit my website, rethinkingresidency.com, to learn more about resident physician stories and ways that residents can most effectively navigate the game of residency. I cannot wait to connect with you on the next episode of Promising Young Surgeon.